Pink Floyd's legacy in rock music is undeniable. Their albums from the late 1960s through the 1980s reshaped the boundaries of progressive rock, mixing sonic experimentation with some of the most ambitious concepts ever put to record. But even within this groundbreaking catalog, not every project was viewed positively by the band members themselves. Roger Waters, the group's driving creative force for much of their peak era, was often brutally honest when looking back at their work. While fans revere Pink Floyd for their innovation, Waters wasn't afraid to dismiss certain albums as pretentious, reflecting a sense that the band had sometimes chased complexity and ambition at the expense of clarity and purpose. After Syd Barrett's departure in 1968, Pink Floyd struggled to define themselves. Albums like A Saucer Full of Secrets and More showed flashes of brilliance, but also meandered into long passages of experimentation. For Waters, these years were about searching for direction, moments of creativity overshadowed by indulgence. As the bassist and lyricist began taking on more control, he grew frustrated with projects that lacked focus. Waters later suggested that some of these early albums, while adventurous, ultimately fell into what he called pretentious noodling, a kind of art for art's sake approach that failed to connect with a clear audience. No album better fits Waters' critique than Ummagumma, released in 1969. The double LP was divided into a live record and a studio experiment where each band member contributed solo pieces. At the time, it was seen as bold, a demonstration of Pink Floyd's willingness to push boundaries. But years later, Waters dismissed it outright. He admitted he couldn't listen to it without wincing, describing much of the material as self-indulgent. The studio half in particular, with lengthy, avant-garde experiments, felt less like cohesive music and more like exercises in sound for sound's sake. For Waters, it symbolized pretension, trying to prove artistic credibility without creating lasting emotional impact. Following Ummagumma, Pink Floyd released Atom Heart Mother in 1970. It was their first album to hit #1 in the UK, driven by the ambitious, side-long title suite featuring orchestras and choirs. At the time, it seemed like a breakthrough, proof that Pink Floyd could combine rock with classical grandeur. But Waters was never satisfied with it. He later referred to the project as a load of rubbish, admitting that the orchestral experiment felt hollow. Even David Gilmour agreed, saying the piece hadn't aged well. Waters criticized it as overblown and ultimately meaningless, a grand gesture without the substance to back it up. To him, Atom Heart Mother represented pretension at its worst, spectacle over substance. Despite these missteps, Waters saw them as necessary growing pains. Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother forced the band to recognize the limits of unchecked experimentation. After these records, Pink Floyd began to refine their approach, focusing more on narrative and emotional core rather than abstract exercises. By the time of Meddle in 1971, Waters and the band had found a balance. The album still featured lengthy compositions, but tracks like Echoes carried both ambition and emotional weight. This shift paved the way for the masterpieces that would follow: The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. Waters' criticism of Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother highlights his blunt nature. He was never one to romanticize the band's past or sugarcoat his opinions. To him, calling the albums pretentious wasn't about dismissing the effort. It was about acknowledging that they hadn't yet learned how to channel their creativity effectively. Fans may still debate the merits of those early experiments. Some argue that Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother contain moments of brilliance and represent an important stage in the band's evolution. But for Waters, their flaws outweighed their strengths. Looking back, it's clear that Waters' frustrations came from a desire for purpose in music. He wanted albums that not only sounded ambitious, but also carried deep meaning. That vision ultimately defined Pink Floyd's golden era in the 1970s, when their records combined sonic innovation with lyrical and conceptual power. The fact that Waters could dismiss entire albums as pretentious shows the high standard he set for the band. And perhaps, without those experimental failures, Pink Floyd might never have reached the heights of The Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. When Roger Waters called Ummagumma and Adam Hart Mother pretentious, it wasn't simply an insult. It was an acknowledgement of the band's growing pains. Those albums reflected a moment when Pink Floyd were still searching for their identity, testing how far they could push sound before discovering the emotional core that would define their legacy. In the end, the very pretension Waters condemned laid the groundwork for their later triumphs. For Pink Floyd, stumbling through indulgence was part of the journey toward timeless greatness.